Thanks for downloading the In Our Time podcast. For more details about In Our Time and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. I hope you enjoy the programme. Hello. In the early 19th century, the Northamptonshire so-called peasant poet John Clare took a look at the countryside and didn't like what he saw. He wrote, "Fence meeting fence in owner's little bounds, of field and meadow, large as gardens' grounds. In little parcels, little minds to please, with men and flocks imprisoned, ill at ease." He is referring to the effects of the 18th century enclosures, literally the fencing in of land to stop others from using it. This apparently simple act has been hugely controversial. For some, enclosure underpinned the economic and agricultural development of modern Britain. For others, it was an act of theft, the turning of common land into private property that impoverished the many for the sake of the few. But what really happened during the era of 18th and early 19th century enclosures? Who gained, who lost, and what role did enclosures play in the agricultural and industrial transformation of this country? With me to discuss the enclosures of the 18th century are Mark Overton, Professor of Economic and Social History at the University of Exeter, Rosemary Sweet, Director of the Centre for Urban History at Leicester University, and Murray Pittock, Bradley Professor of English Literature at the University of Glasgow. Rosemary Sweet, can you explain to us what enclosure actually means?
Well, enclosure took place when there was a transfer from the traditional system of open field farming to a system where you had enclosed fields. So what would happen is that before enclosure you'd have a system of open fields which might be several hundred acres in size, and these would be divided up into strips which the property owners would farm. These strips might be scattered and they weren't separated by fences or hedges. They were simply strips of land within these large several hundred acre fields. There would also be land which was common land which would be used for grazing. What happens through enclosure is that these strips are consolidated so that the property owners end up with unified units of land, and these are marked out through fences or hedges, and you have absolute property rights over them. That before enclosure, with the open field system, there was a common right usage of this land, that the fields would be farmed communally, that you had to have consensus as to when you were going to plough or when you were going to let the animals in to the land when it had been harvested in order to manure the land. You needed consensus, but after enclosure the land was yours and you could farm it as you wished. You didn't have to be part of a greater unit, if you like, that you had greater autonomy and you had absolute property rights over it.
Can we just develop the idea of the common land, because it's a phrase that comes easily and a lot of people have a bit of an idea about it, but it's worth going into more detail. What was the common land for small farmers, labourers, yeoman farmers and that sort of thing? What could they do on the common land?
Well, common land wasn't land which was open to the general public. It was land over which people in that village generally had rights, so that anybody who owned property or who indeed was a tenant of property in that village to which the common land belonged had the right to use that land. The land actually nominally belonged to the lord of the manor, but the inhabitants of the village had rights of usage, which might be pasturing cattle, or it might be collecting turf from the ground, which could be used for fuel. It might be collecting firewood. It might be collecting any kind of fruit or berries or other kind of, subsidiary food. It might be for keeping geese on, but it was rights of usage. And
customary rights.
Customary rights of usage, yes.
And this went quite far down the class chain, didn't it? When you say property, you just had to own a little bit, a tiny little bit of land, and you could go onto this common land. Yes. And it could be a big part of your income for the people who are scraping a living. It could be a big part of the living they scraped. Indeed.
In theory, you had to be able to support a cow in order to be able to pasture it on the common land. But the right to pasture cows was one which could extend right, as you say, extend right down the social chain, so that people with very, very small holdings of land, possibly only 1 or 2 acres, might have rights of common land. And you also had squatters who were simply established rights by usage. They didn't actually own any property, but they simply established customary rights. And the right to pasture a cow could actually be a very important part of a family's income. There are calculations which suggest that the profits from having a cow, if you like, from producing the milk and other byproducts, could actually amount to at least the value of half a year's annual wages. And so this could be a crucial supplement to families' incomes. And equally important would have been the right to gather firewood, because fuel was one of the most expensive items in a householder's expenditure. And if you didn't have fuel, you couldn't cook, you weren't able to heat, and the standard of living would go down dramatically.
Murray Piddock, so if an 18th century village were to be enclosed, now we must make it clear that by 1600 about half the land in this country was enclosed, and a bit more was enclosed in by 1700. But in the 18th century, something different came in. Parliament came in. But we'll come to that in a moment. But if the village were to be enclosed, what would happen, and who would do well from it? Who would do badly from it?
Well, the kind of people who would do well from the enclosure of the land were doubly landowners. First of all, because they had greater freedom to use the land and on a larger scale than ever before, to develop it and to improve it. And it's no real coincidence that improvement of the land comes together with the last major phase of enclosure. Secondly, landowners would benefit from being able to sell the land because commercial successes in the city and elsewhere wanted to buy land in increasing numbers in the 17th and 18th centuries, and the price of land in real terms went up. So you got a double whammy for as far as the landowners were concerned. The Church of England clergy whose income depended very heavily on rental from land, benefited enormously. By 1823, the canons of Durham Cathedral were on £3,000 a year, which was between 50 and 100 times the annual salary of a village schoolmaster. So the status of the Church of England, particularly clergy in good livings, changed enormously in the 19th century. And thirdly, arguably, in terms of benefits, the landscape benefited with the draining of bogland in Scotland, with the improvement of heathland in England, and with afforestation as well. And in terms of the people who lost out, obviously the people who lost out were people with common rights of the land. They lost out very largely, but also people who continued to have some rights in the land as tenant farmers lost out, because increasingly, this was part of the process of the loss of common rights, increasingly they were asked for rent in cash terms rather than in kind terms. So you couldn't use chickens for rent anymore. It had to be cash on the nail. And that, combined with a loss of, for a small tenant farmer, gathering firewood could be a ploughman's wages a week in terms of income, as Rosemary was suggesting. That actually started to drive them towards the wall towards the end of the 18th century, so they lost out. And just to show that it wasn't all bad, highwaymen lost out as well, because the enclosure of the heaths round London meant that the hideouts and the places where highwaymen could rove were no longer so bleak, so open, and so in common as they have been before. And so it's no coincidence the last recorded highway robbery was in 1831, towards the very end of this period. Was
the idea of absolute rights over property, did that get a big kick forward in the 18th century? Because I have an idea, and if I'm wrong, you'll knock it on the head, we'll move on, that although you, the landlord of the manor, owned the land, customary rights meant that the people around could drift onto it, they could graze their cattle, they could collect the firewood, and so on and so forth. But when you fence it in, it became your absolute property. Is that right?
Broadly speaking, that is right, yes. I mean, I think sometimes you needed an act of Parliament. Sometimes you really need to enforce the rights. Sometimes you need the agreement, certainly the 1760s, the agreement of those with common rights to the land. But the trouble was actually that in the 18th century, the increasing number of squatters, and it was sometimes hard to know who had common rights in certain places. So you do get a stronger sense of absolute ownership, and you also get a sense, since many of the rights were customary, it was difficult to prove them. And so they
weren't written down.
Not always, no.
Yeah, and that proved to be, when Parliament started to move in, that proved to be a severe disadvantage.
It is a critical phase. Yeah, it is a disadvantage.
Mark Overton, let's just keep talking about enclosure. We'll come to it. What effect would it have on a village? I mean, I'd like listeners, I like myself actually, to know about the appearance. So we've got a place, let us say in Cumberland, and on the Solway Plain, very rich plain there, strip farming, large holdings and so on and so forth. It's what it is in 1700. Enclosure by 1800. How has it changed? What's different about the way it looks?
Well, as John Clare said, new farms, new fences. The farms would move out of the centre of the village. With an open field farm, all the farms tended to be in the centre of the village because that was the optimal place to be. If your land was scattered around, you were in the centre of it. So the farms would move out. The farms tended the farmhouses would tend to have the farms around them. There'd be ring-fence farms.
After enclosure?
After enclosure. Yeah. Many more fields, often with straight lines. If a field boundary wiggles, it's old. If it's straight, it's probably dating from the 18th century with enclosure. And hedges, of course, often hawthorn, because it grew very quickly and was pretty good at keeping stock out.
Hawthorn on the bar. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. New roads, often as well, but many rights of way cut off. I mean, it was part of removing common rights. The rights to walk from A to B would be curtailed, so people would have to find new ways of actually moving around a village.
Would it change the structure of the village? You've talked about the farms. When you say moving out, would they literally build it somewhere else, or would they build the land around themselves?
No, they'd build new farmhouses. You can see many 18th century, 19th century farmhouses sitting on their own, a mile or so away from what was formerly a nucleated village.
And what would happen to the nucleated village? Would that change at all, or would that would that decay? What would happen there?
Wouldn't necessarily decay. It's just that the farmers would move out of it. I mean, there would still be church, pub, whatever in the village.
Excuse me, sorry. What social effect did this have? I mean, the way that people related to each other, to use that's rather not a word I like. But anyway, there you go. What would happen there?
Well, just by changing the layout and the geography of the village, you can imagine that it would change the nature of social interaction. And one feature of open field farming was that farmers did lots of things together. And certainly they had to make decisions about what to do when. And so running an open field village involved a lot of sitting around, talking, negotiating, arguing, working out what was the best way to do things.
To do what? Just be more specific, please.
When do we throw the cattle onto the open fields after the harvest? When do we break open the meadows and put the animals onto them? These are sort of strategic farming decisions that were made cooperatively.
So it's cooperative, not a commune, but it's a cooperation.
It's not a commune, but they have to decide together to do things because the land is so intermixed. One person really can't do his own thing. So
strips, 3 strips, adjacent strip belong to Mr. A, Mr. B and Mr. C. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then that changed?
Yes, that changed so that farmers were essentially farming on their own. They were making their own decisions. They were deciding what to do, and they weren't bound by the village consensus as to what they could do when.
Would this have been thought at the time as a massive upheaval? Did it happen quickly? Did it happen gradually over the 100 years of the 18th century? It had started before. We've already rather briefly established that. It'll go on a bit into the 19th century. But would people living through that be aware of an upheaval?
Yeah, it was not quite overnight, but over a period of 2 years. Yeah. Because given that you've got to keep producing food, given the land's got to be used, you've got to really do it quite suddenly. But it wasn't necessarily new or unprecedented, because enclosure only affected certain parts of England. There were certain counties, such as Kent, for example, which had never had enclosure and where this way of farming was the norm.
Can I come back to you, Murray Piddock? Enclosure wasn't new, as Mark said, but what's distinctive about enclosure in the period we're talking about is the involvement of Parliament and the Enclosure Acts. Can you describe the relationship between Parliament's interventions here and land ownership?
Well, I think that one of the crucial things is that land ownership is intimately connected to parliamentary representation, and sometimes it's the same people who are involved. And one of the features of that is that there's a spine of control in English society, you can argue, which runs right from the fact that the ownership of land which has got a capital value is an easier way to access